Imagine walking into a medieval marketplace, the air filled with the smell of freshly baked bread. Bakers are rushing about, their wooden ovens blazing hot, their tables stacked high with loaves, buns, and rolls. Bread wasn't just food in those days, it was survival. For many, it was the single most important part of their daily diet. But here's the strange part, if a baker dared to bake a loaf that was even slightly too small, they weren't just risking an unhappy customer. No, they were risking fines, public humiliation, and sometimes even jail. All for bread. And out of this strange world came the famous phrase, a baker's dozen. But why 13 instead of 12? And what kind of law could force bakers to give away extra bread for free? The answer takes us deep into the odd and, at times, brutal world of medieval laws. Back then, medieval England had something called the Assize of Bread and Ale. Think of it as one of the very first consumer protection laws. It sounds modern, right? But this was no friendly rule to help customers. It was strict, unforgiving, and dangerous for bakers. The law dictated exactly how much a loaf of bread should weigh and exactly how much it should cost. And we're not talking about rough estimates here. Officials, sometimes called bread inspectors, would actually go around the marketplace weighing bread. If your loaf didn't meet the standard, you weren't just getting a warning. You could be fined heavily or, in worse cases, dragged out in front of the entire town for punishment. And punishments in medieval times weren't exactly light. If your bread was too small, you might be placed in the stocks, where people would throw rotten food at you. Sometimes, bakers were paraded through town with their underweight loaves hung around their necks as a public sign of shame. Imagine being branded as the town's dishonest baker, everyone laughing at you, children mocking you, and your business destroyed forever. All because your flour didn't rise as much as expected. It was humiliation designed to make an example out of you. That's how seriously they took bread. Why so extreme? Because bread really was life. In many medieval towns, people ate bread with nearly every meal. A poor family might survive almost entirely on bread, ale, and maybe some cheese. So if a baker cheated them, even by a few ounces, it wasn't just unfair, it was dangerous. People could starve. And the authorities knew this. Keeping bread consistent and affordable wasn't just about fairness, it was about keeping order in society. Hungry people cause riots, and riots threaten kings. So, the law of bread wasn't just about food. It was about power. Now here's where things get strange. Bakers, knowing the risks, had to find a clever way to protect themselves. What if their bread lost weight after cooling down? What if flour quality changed and they ended up a few ounces short without realizing it? To avoid the risk of punishment, many bakers began adding one extra loaf for every 12 they sold. If a customer asked for a dozen, they'd get 13. That way, even if one loaf came out a little underweight, the baker would still meet the legal standard overall. And just like that, the baker's dozen was born. But this wasn't generosity. It wasn't kindness. It was pure survival. The extra loaf was like insurance, a small price to pay compared to the ruin that could come from being caught cheating. Over time, the practice became so common that people began to expect it. Buy a dozen loaves. You get 13. Not because the baker liked you, but because the law scared them into it. That's how a weird medieval punishment gave us a phrase we still use today. But let's pause here. Imagine being a baker in the 13th century. You wake up before dawn, spend hours mixing dough by hand, stoke the fire in your oven until the heat is almost unbearable, and finally pull out your loaves. They smell wonderful, golden brown and steaming hot. But instead of being proud of your work, you're terrified. Is that one loaf too small? Did the flour shrink in the oven? Will the inspector show up today? The stress must have been overwhelming. And while other merchants might haggle or cheat their customers, bakers were constantly under the eye of the law. For them, every single loaf carried a risk. Some historians believe that the baker's dozen wasn't just about protecting bakers, it was also about protecting customers from fraud. Bread was often adulterated with things like chalk or sand to make it heavier. Yes, bakers actually put ground-up stone into bread. Why? Because flour was expensive, and a heavier loaf meant more money. So when customers got an extra loaf, they probably felt safer knowing they weren't being cheated. It was a small but powerful sign of trust. Even if one loaf was bad, at least you had another. Of course, this wasn't the only weird law around bread. Some towns had rules about when you could bake, how much wood you could use, and even the shape of the bread itself. Bakers weren't free artisans. They were controlled, monitored, and punished if they stepped out of line. In a way, they were like soldiers in the king's army, serving not just their customers, but the stability of the entire kingdom. If bread prices rose too high, riots could break out. And in history, bread riots weren't rare. Centuries later, in France, bread shortages would spark the French Revolution. People have always risen up when bread disappeared from their tables. Kings and rulers knew this, which is why the laws were so strict. Control the bread, control the people. Let's not forget the darker side of this. Some bakers, accused of cheating, were thrown into prison. Others faced brutal punishments like having their shops destroyed or their equipment seized. Imagine spending your life building up a bakery, only to see it burned down by order of the town officials because your bread was a few ounces short. It wasn't just about fines or public shame. It could be the end of your livelihood, your family, and your future. All tied to a single loaf of bread. And yet, from this harsh world, we get a phrase that today feels almost cheerful. When we hear, a baker's dozen, we think of getting a bonus, a little extra, something nice. But behind that extra loaf is a history of fear, punishment, and survival. It's a reminder of just how strange and unforgiving medieval laws could be. The next time you hear the phrase, imagine a nervous baker slipping one more loaf into a customer's basket, hoping to avoid the inspector's wrath. What makes this law even stranger is how it stuck. Even after the assize of bread and ale faded away, the tradition of the baker's dozen lived on. It became a cultural memory, passed down through generations, long after the punishments ended. Today, it's almost a joke, a baker's dozen means 13. But in medieval times, it was deadly serious. It was life and death for bakers, and survival for their customers. Think about it. A single law, written centuries ago, not only shaped how bakers worked but left behind a phrase we still use daily. That's the power of history. And that's the odd beauty of the medieval world. Strange, brutal, and unforgettable. So the next time you order a dozen donuts or bagels and someone throws in an extra, remember where that tradition began. Not with kindness. Not with generosity. But with fear, fear of the inspector's scale, fear of the crowd's mockery, fear of the law. One of the strangest laws in history gave us one of the most ordinary phrases in our language. And it all started with bread.